exclude people if they want to do that.
How are we doing here?
Just a second, live stream loading.
People tell me as much as like 5 minutes after,
Right.
and then some it's due.
We do get some today. The main issue for us today is that it's Friday.
Yeah, I know. So I would have been willing to do it. Or can we get rid of that?
Yeah.
Or we just you say it. But we are at 4 p.m. on Friday, and I could have done this at noon, but
We have some folks on Zoom as well, which is good.
good. Loaded of folks on Zoom.
All right, Chris, we live, we go?
Yep.
All right, so thanks everybody for coming in a Friday afternoon. I'm glad to have with us today Ilya Somin from George Mason University, Professor of Law at George Mason University. He nicely volunteered to give a talk to us while he was in town for the Federalist Society National Student Conference tomorrow, where he's going to be speaking in the afternoon on a panel on federalism and democracy. So if you want to join for that, you can look at the Federalist Society website. You might be able to find the information for that event as well. He's actually talking to us today, although he writes on a lot of different things. You might find his writings a lot on the blog Bollock Conspiracy quite a bit on all sorts of matters of law. But today he's going to talk about some work that he's been doing for a while now that culminated in this book a few years back, a couple years ago.
Revised edition last year.
All right. So on Free to Move, and again, some of you might be familiar with the work of one of our scholars here that visits a lot in the center, that writes one of our blogs, Brian Kaplan, that works a lot on immigration as well. So I'm curious to see if there's what are the main points of contention between the two of you, if any, in this particular way. So Ilya, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Salem Center for organizing this event and all of you for coming, particularly coming out on a Friday afternoon where I know particularly for students, that's often a time you have other more exciting things to do. So today I'm going to talk about my book, Free to Move, Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. Ironically, the first edition of this book was published in April of 2020, right as much of the world was going into the lockdown. But Oxford University Press and I later agreed that we would do a second edition and have it come out faster than second editions usually do. Among other things, I incorporated the pandemic and a number of other issues that came up in the last couple of years. If anything good comes out of the horrors of the COVID pandemic, perhaps it might be a new appreciation for the value of freedom of movement. So in the book, I'm going to talk about how voting with your feet in different forms often is a better way of exercising political choice than voting at the ballot boxes. I'll start off by just mentioning the three types of foot voting that I discuss in the book. One is voting with your feet in a federal system, where you can choose what state or local government you want to live under, based at least in part on the government policies. Another is foot voting in the private sector. I'll talk a bit more about exactly how that works when we get to that part of the presentation. And then finally, and most controversially, foot voting through international migration, which although it is the most controversial type, it's also the type where there are the greatest potential gains. But first things first, we want to ask first, why should we even think about voting with your feet as a mode of political choice? After all, in the United States and other democracies, we typically think that the way we decide what government policies we want to live under is that we go to the ballot box. We choose the Democrats or the Republicans, Biden or Trump, or occasionally we might vote for a third party that the chance of them winning is extremely small. And that's what we mean by exercising political choice. And I think that definitely has some value. However, it is the case that foot voting, the voting at the ballot box, has severe limitations. One of them is that the chance that your vote will make a difference is infinitesimally small. In an American presidential election, it's usually about 1 in 60 million. It can be somewhat higher than that if you live in a swing state. If you live in a clearly red or blue state like Texas, the chance that your vote will make a difference is even smaller than that. Even in a state or local election, the chance your vote will make a difference is extremely low. In most cases, we would not say that you have meaningful freedom of choice if your decision has only a 1 in 1 billion or a 1 in 60 billion chance of determining the outcome. We wouldn't say you have meaningful freedom of religion if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what faith you want to practice or whether you want to practice one at all. We wouldn't say you have meaningful freedom of speech if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what type of speech you're allowed to express. That's not significant freedom. And I would say that the same thing is true of political freedom. If you have only a 1 in 1 million chance or a 1 in 60 million chance of being able to determine what government policies you're going to be living under, that's not much of a political choice at all. Now, the second limitation of ballot box voting is very closely related to the first. And that is precisely because there is so little chance that your vote will make a difference. You have very little incentive to seek out information about the policies and issues that are at stake and to make an informed choice. And in fact, in this book and in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, where I go into this in greater detail, I look at the evidence on what voters know and don't know, and it turns out that levels of political knowledge are extraordinarily low. Most voters don't even know such basic things as what are the 3 branches of the federal government. Only about a third of Americans know what those things are. They often also don't know other basic things like which government officials are responsible for which issues, what are the effects of different government policies, and so on. The American Medical Association says that before a doctor is allowed to treat you, they have to get your informed consent. Now, most government policies, many of them at least, often also have life and death implications, just like medical treatment sometimes does. We all saw that during the pandemic, but even during normal times, they can have a big impact on people's lives. Yet, under democratic government, for most people, most of the time, government policy is like a doctor whose ministrations you're not allowed to refuse. And most of the patients have very little idea whether the doctor really is treating their disease or whether they're instead peddling snake oil that isn't doing any good and might actually make things worse. So there are these 2 significant weaknesses of ballot box voting, and foot voting actually is superior on both of these dimensions. When you vote with your feet, if you're allowed to do so, that's a decision that has a very high likelihood of actually making a difference. If you move from one state to another or one country to another, that ensures that you will in fact be living under the government policies of the destination rather than under the ones you left behind. And for that very reason, both economic theory and extensive empirical evidence show that foot voters seek out more information than ballot box voters do, and they generally do a better and less biased job of evaluating it. So there's advantages along both of those dimensions. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time and effort seeking out relevant information the last time you decided what television set to buy than the last time you decided who to vote for president or in any other election. That's not because your television deals with more complicated issues than the president does or that it's more important. It's that when you decide what TV to buy, you know that that's the one that will probably end up in your living room. But if you turn it on and you have the misfortune of seeing the president or the governor or some other powerful politician, the chance that you can affect who that is and what policies they will pursue is extraordinarily small. And therefore, most people spend much less time and effort on that decision, on acquiring information, than when they decide how to vote with their feet. In the book, I discuss how these 2 advantages of foot voting over ballot box voting, they translate into superiority of foot voting from the standpoint of multiple different types of theories of political freedom associated with both the left and the right. I won't go through these theories in detail here, but I'm happy to do so in questions. And they certainly are a wide range of theories, ranging from John Rawls' theory to non-domination theory to consent theory and others. So it's not just one specific libertarian or specific other theory that it turns out these 2 factors matter. They matter from the standpoint of a wide range of approaches to political freedom. So I'll now try to take a closer look at the three particular types of foot voting, starting with the most familiar one, foot voting under federalism. In the United States, foot voting under federalism can potentially give people a very wide range of choices. We have 50 states and a number of territories, many thousands of local governments with different kinds of policies. That gives you a much wider range of options than you can just by choosing the Democrats or the Republicans at the national level. And it makes it more likely that you can find options that will fit your particular preferences and needs. Historically, this has been particularly valuable to the poor and disadvantaged, to groups that are badly off or discriminated against in particular areas. A famous example is African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow era South, more recently gays and lesbians moving to more tolerant and friendly jurisdictions. There are many other historical examples of this that can be mentioned. I'll just add one more that is sort of interesting. In the 19th century, a number of Western states like Wyoming and Utah that you wouldn't think of being as especially progressive or egalitarian, they gave equal rights to women, including to vote, before any Eastern states did. Why? Because initially the settlers there were mostly men. The men quickly figured out that, we're not likely to get married if the male-female ratio here is like 5-to-1 or whatever it was at the time. So they offered women more rights to come there. And that's an example of how women at that time, definitely an oppressed group, were able to take advantage of vote voting opportunities. And there's many other examples like this throughout American history and that of other federal systems as well. In more recent years, obstacles have arisen to foot voting under federalism. The biggest one is exclusionary zoning, which sadly in many parts of the country makes it almost impossible to build new housing in response to demand, and does in particular makes it hard for the poor and the lower middle class to move to these places. In the book, I offer proposals for reducing that problem and also for breaking down other barriers to intra-jurisdictional mobility. I'll take questions at the end. So it might be that some questions will be answered during the process of the talk. And that way we'll get through, but I promise I will get to everyone's question. I'll say as long as it's necessary to do that. So there are obviously other potential limitations to foot voting under federalism. The most obvious one is moving costs, that it might be costly in various ways to move. There's no way to completely eliminate this problem, but one way to reduce it is if you decentralize power to lower levels of government. It's often less costly to move from one town to another in the same general region than it is to move across the country, and there are other ways to reduce moving costs as well. In the book, I also deal at some length with other standard objections, such as fears that this would cause a race to the bottom if there was too much opportunity for people to vote with their feet, and I'm happy to talk about that in the questions. For now, I'll move on to this issue, which is one of the ones that led me to write a revised edition, which is the implications of remote work for voting with your feet. And in one sense, there's a potentially big advantage here in that it might increase your opportunities for foot voting, because now potentially you can separate where you work from where you live, and therefore you can potentially work for a firm in New York but live in Omaha or something like that. So in that respect, it increases opportunities for foot voting. On the other hand, you can argue it might reduce those opportunities, because often a big reason in the past for people to vote with their feet is to find more job opportunities. And obviously, if job opportunities are no longer dependent on residency, then this becomes less significant. However, it's also important to recall, especially for people like perhaps many of us in this room, that the vast majority of the population still cannot, in fact, work remotely. Over 80% of Americans who have jobs are employed in jobs where you have to be in the office more than 2 days a week of work. And even of those who it's not absolutely essential that they be there, sometimes it makes you more productive if you interact with your colleagues in person and the like. So fully remote work is still a relatively small minority that can do it. That minority may grow over time, but for now at least, foot voting for job opportunities is still going to be important, and job opportunities often are heavily influenced by variations in government policy. I would add lastly in this section that there are ways to incentivize competition between jurisdictions, which might make these foot voting opportunities even better and more effective. In the book, I go through a number of strategies by which that can be done. For now, I'll press on to a form of foot voting which is probably less familiar, and that is the idea of voting with your feet in the private sector. But although it's less familiar, there are in fact private institutions that provide goods and services that are similar to those traditionally provided by state and local governments. The best example, private planned communities. These are things like homeowners associations, condominiums, and others, which provide all sorts of goods and services that local governments often provide, including things like security, entertainment, even education in many cases. And there are already over 70 million Americans who live in these types of institutions. So this is already a widespread practice. That figure refutes by itself, I think, the traditional criticism that this is something that only the wealthy can do, or as Robert B. Reich famously put it, this is a secession of the successful. Unless you have a very broad definition of who counts as wealthy, this just isn't true. And it also is the case that in a given area, you can fit more private communities and private options than local government, so the freedom of choice can be further expanded, moving costs can be further lowered with these sorts of institutions. And this applies not just for private planned communities, but to a lot of other kinds of private provision of traditional government services. An obvious example is private schooling. If we had universal school choice programs, people could choose to send their kids to private schools instead of public ones if that's what they wanted to do. And they could even do that without having to physically move, that is, without having to buy a house in a new location. And there's a lot of evidence that those sorts of options especially benefit the poor and disadvantaged. It is true, however, that at least in the status quo, these kinds of alternatives are less widely available to the poor and even the lower middle class than to those wealthier. In the book, I offer ways to expand that, including by breaking down restrictions on land use that in many places make it harder to establish new private planned communities. I also suggest, in line with some previous scholars, that we can eliminate the double taxation of people who live in these. That is, that if you live in one of these communities and it provides you with services that are traditionally provided by local government, you can get a discount on your taxes, so you're not paying twice for the same service, and that is another way to make this more available to more people. So it is not my contention that every aspect of government policy can be subject to foot voting through either federalism or in the private sector. There are some problems that are so large scale, perhaps they can only be done by the national government or even by some kind of international body. Global warming is probably an example like that. There are a few others, but the vast majority of policies currently handled by the government are subject to this kind of decentralization, as shown by the success of relatively small countries like Denmark, New Zealand, Switzerland, and so forth, which are smaller than many American cities, yet manage perfectly well to have their own education policies, their own pension policies, their own policies in a very wide range of issues. If they can do that, certainly Texas can do it, and indeed even some sub-regions of Texas or cities like Austin or Houston and the like. So there's a lot of decentralization that we can do to facilitate more foot voting, and there's also ways that we can break down barriers to freedom of movement that makes foot voting possible as well. I'll now move on to what I think is the most controversial kind of foot voting through international migration. And while it is controversial, obviously, and both in the United States and in Europe, we see a considerable political backlash against it in some quarters. Nonetheless, the gains here are truly enormous. Think of whatever you believe is the best governed American state and compare it to whatever you think is the worst. It's probably a significant difference, but it's small compared to the kinds of differences we see with international migration, refugees fleeing Cuba, communist dictatorship, Syrians fleeing the horrible oppression and civil war in that country. More recently, just within the last year, Ukrainians fleeing Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion in the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II, and also Russians fleeing Putin's increasingly oppressive regime within Russia itself. Some 1 million Russians have fled in the last year. If people in these sorts of situations are able to reach a freer society, they immediately experience vast changes in terms of not just political freedom narrowly defined, but every other kind of freedom or human right as well, whether it's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, what have you. You can tell a similar story about ethnic minorities, religious minorities fleeing persecution, women fleeing patriarchal societies like Saudi Arabia, and other such examples. The gains here are just enormous. They're enormous in terms of economic gains as well as freedom. Economists estimate that if we had full free migration throughout the world's GDP would double. That is, we would be twice as productive as we currently are. The reason for this is that there are so many millions of people trapped under governments that are oppressive, corrupt, or otherwise flawed, such that no matter how smart those people are or how hardworking, they have almost no chance of escaping poverty. If a person in dispossession is able to move to the US or Canada or Western Europe or another similar, freer, more successful society, they can almost immediately become 2 or 3 times more productive than they were before. And that's not even counting improvements in their skills, which are also more likely to occur in these places than the ones they came from. So the gains are truly enormous. On top of that, it's worth noting that for the roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the world's population that lives under authoritarian governments, foot voting through international migration is virtually their only chance of being able to exercise any political choice at all. They don't even have the sort of 1 in a million chance that we might have by voting at the ballot box, because there is no meaningful ballot box in those countries. So despite these enormous advantages, there are obviously all sorts of objections to foot voting through international migration. And in the book, I divide them into 2 categories. One is a set of arguments which says that governments have a general right to keep people out. And another which says, even if there's no general right, we often have to restrict things in order to prevent particular negative side effects of migration, such as overburdening the welfare state, or immigrants being bad voters, voting in terrible governments, and so forth. I'll start off with the general idea that there's a right to restrict. The most common form of this is a theory which says that particular parts of the world are owned by specific racial or ethnic groups, and those racial, ethnic, or cultural groups, they have the right to keep other people out. Does the poster up on the screen right now, French nationalist poster, which says La France aux Français, France for the French. Similarly, we can say Germany for the Germans, Italy for the Italians, and so on. This sort of argument is commonly heard in many places. You don't get it so often in the US, because the implication for us maybe is that Native Americans are the true owners of the land and they have the right to expel everyone else. And that's not an implication most American immigration restriction is like. But even on its own terms, and even as applied to other countries, this argument has many severe flaws. I'll just mention the single biggest one, which is that taken seriously, it's a rationale for ethnic or racial discrimination. That it says where you live should be determined by what your race or ethnicity is. We reject this within countries. We reject the racial segregation that occurred under Jim Crow in the US or under South African apartheid. If it's wrong there, it's equally wrong internationally, because the reasons why it's wrong domestically also apply internationally. Domestically, it's wrong because what race you are is not something that you can control, and it's not something that determines how good a person you are or how much freedom you're entitled to. And exactly the same thing is true internationally. And I think this point has broader implications even for immigration restrictions that are not racial or ethnic in nature, because those other kinds of restrictions, even so, still generally restrict people based on where they were born or who their parents are. If you were not born in the US and your parents are not US citizens, Generally speaking, you can only get in if the US government gives you special permission to do so. And this is still arbitrary and unjust because because obviously you have no control over who your parents are or where you were born, just as you have no control over what race or ethnicity you belong to. And we readily recognize all of this when we think about something like the feudal system of medieval Europe, where if you were born a noble, you could move around freely if you wanted to. On the other hand, if you were a serf, you could only move around if the nobles would let you do so. And what is the terrible thing that the serfs did that consigned them to this fate? The mistake they made is they chose the wrong parents. So they ended up in the status of being a serf. We readily see why this is wrong, but the current system of immigration restrictions works much the same way. If you're a citizen, or if you were born a citizen of a particular relatively advanced society, then you're allowed to live there. If you were not born there and you also weren't born to parents who are citizens, then you're not allowed to live there. This is much the same kind of restriction as the restriction based on whether your parents are nobles or whether your parents are serfs. In the United States, as opposed to the ethnic or racial argument, we more often hear this kind of argument, which says that the rights of governments are to exclude people are similar to those of homeowners or members of a club. So I can exclude people from coming into my house if I want to, and I don't necessarily have to have a good reason to say I don't like this person so they can't come in. Similarly, I can form a club where only the people that I and the other members want to be able to join are allowed to enter. For example, I'm a Boston Red Sox fan. I can say only other Red Sox fans are allowed to join this club. Everybody else is out of luck. So similarly, you could say the United States is like a house or a club, and therefore it can keep people out. If you make this argument, it has dire implications, not just for immigrants, but also for natives. And to consider that the owner of a house has the right to restrict speech or religion within it. I can say only Republicans are allowed to come into my house, or only Christians. The only form of religious service allowed in the house is a Christian service or a Muslim service, whatever one I prefer. So effectively, if you analogize government policy to this, then it's effectively a justification for a totalitarian state. Almost any kinds of restrictions on liberty that the government wanted to put in would be allowable under this. And of course, you can say the same thing with the club analogy. I can have a Christian club or a Muslim club, a Republican club or a Democratic club that keeps out all but the people who adhere to those viewpoints or those religions. And so the club analogy also has this totalitarian implication. There are other flaws with these analogies as well that I go into in the book. But for now, I'm going to go on to theories which say that even if there isn't a general right to exclude people, what there is a right to exclude people to prevent various kinds of negative side effects. For instance, maybe immigrants will overburden the welfare state. Maybe they will come in and vote for terrible politicians. I know it's really hard to believe, but if you have too many of the wrong kinds of immigrants, they might elect a president of the United States who has no regard for liberal democratic values whatsoever. And if he loses an election, instead of admitting his defeat and going away, he might incite violence to try to keep himself in power and make false claims of voter fraud and otherwise try to stay in power rather than give it up. Very difficult to believe, but too many of the wrong kinds of voters could result in that. And there's many other kinds of scenarios that people have offered by which immigration might potentially cause harm. I go through them all in the book. Here, I'll just go through the general framework that I advocate for dealing with these kinds of issues. It requires us to ask three questions. First, how big is this problem really? In many cases, it turns out that the problem is either non-existent or relatively small. For example, far from overburdening the welfare state, the data shows that the overwhelming majority of immigrants in the US and other advanced nations actually are net contributors to the public fisc. They pay more in taxes than they take out. Similarly, far from increasing crime, they actually have lower crime rates in Native or American states. So the crime rate goes down with more immigration rather than going up. But let's say there really is a problem, and I don't exclude the possibility that in some cases there might be. Still, you would want to ask them the second question, is there a keyhole solution? That is a solution that enables us to address the problem by means less draconian than immigration restrictions. And it turns out in almost every case there is. So if you do worry that immigrants are overburdening the welfare state, we could do more of what we already do under the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, and that is limit immigrants' eligibility for welfare benefits or even eliminate it entirely. If you worry that immigrants will be bad voters, you can again do more of what we already do. We already say they must wait at least 5 years before they can become citizens, and even then they must pass a civics test that most native-born Americans would fail if they had to take it without studying for it. And you could potentially make the test harder, you can make the waiting period longer, and so forth. And there are similar mechanisms for a wide range of other problems as well. But what if there is a problem and for whatever reason there just isn't any keyhole solution? Then still I would want to ask the third question, which is, can we tap some of the vast wealth created by migration to alleviate the problem that way? Remember, I pointed out that free migration throughout the world would double world GDP. That's an enormous amount of additional resources, some of which could potentially be used to address problems caused by migration itself. So let's say, for instance, migration did increase crime. You could use some of the money saved, some of the money created by this increased wealth to hire more police officers. There's a lot of data which shows having more police on the streets reduces crime. Indeed, in the book, I point out that we could get many thousands of new ordinary police officers just by abolishing ICE, one of the immigration enforcement arms of the federal government, and spending the same money on regular police. Tens of thousands of additional police officers could be put on the streets by that means alone, and you could do more along those lines if you wanted to. And there's similar tapping the wealth options for many other kinds of potential problems that might be created by migration. This is true for the issue of spreading disease, which during the COVID pandemic led to the most severe immigration restrictions in all of American history, or at least have provided a pretext for putting them in, as there's evidence that under the Trump administration, they already knew this probably wouldn't do much to spread the disease, or to contain the disease, but they did institute it anyway. So if you apply my three-part framework to this, it turns out it works pretty well. It is indeed true that COVID and some other diseases are deadly and dangerous, so I admit there is a real problem. It's actually not at all clear that migration restrictions can prevent the problem from occurring in any significant way. As I noted, we had the most severe immigration restrictions ever, and yet every variant of COVID still got into the United States, and it still got into the United States pretty fast, so the migration restrictions did almost nothing to prevent that. But let's say they were actually effective. Still, there are keyhole solutions. One obvious one is a quarantine at the border for 7 days or 10 days or however long the CDC or other government agency thinks it's necessary. A quarantine like that would be a showstopper for people who are coming as tourists or on short-term business. But for a migrant coming to the United States permanently, that's a small price to pay for a lifetime of greater freedom and prosperity. Similarly, when vaccination can stop the spread of disease, you can use a vaccination keyhole. Come in so long as you accept vaccination. And these keyholes are much better than trying to exclude people entirely, because if you try to exclude people entirely, you get many people trying to come in illegally and not being willing to cooperate with public health authorities. And also you end up with immigration detention centers like the ones we have now, which are themselves actually breeding grounds, not just for COVID, but for other kinds of diseases as well. I would note also that by restricting immigration, we actually make ourselves more vulnerable to the spread of disease in the long run, because increased migration also increases innovation in science and technology, including those innovations that prevent the spread of disease. The first two COVID vaccines that were effective in order to deploy the United States, the Pfizer and Moderna ones, they were both developed in large part by immigrants or children of immigrants from poor nations. If these people had been forced to stay in their countries of origin, they wouldn't have developed those vaccines, or certainly wouldn't have developed them as fast. Many more people would have died in COVID. If we increase migration further, we can prevent further problems of this kind. We can potentially cure many more diseases, develop many more vaccines, and so forth. On average, the data shows that immigrants to the US, Canada, and Europe produce much more in the way of these sorts of scientific innovations per capita than native-born citizens do. In the last part of the book, I talk about a number of institutional implications for both domestic political institutions and for constitutional law of this, and also for international law. Here, I'll just summarize a few of these very briefly. In terms of domestic constitutional design, we want to have obviously a more decentralized constitutional system so as to enable more foot voting and also more competition. We also want to structure it in ways that incentivize competition between subnational governments. For example, if subnational governments have to raise all or most of their funds on their own, rather than relying on grants from the central government, that gives them more incentive to compete for potential taxpayers. Also, there are various constitutional individual rights that can help promote foot voting as well. I give some examples in the book, but an obvious one is the right to property, which enables people to build more housing on their property in response to demand, thereby enabling more internal migration. Another obvious individual right with a connection is the right to travel, the right to freedom of movement. So subnational governments should not be allowed to keep people out forcibly, and they also should not be allowed, in effect, lock their own people in. In history, there are examples of subnational governments trying to do both of these things. Fortunately, modern constitutional law in the US, for the most part, forbids this, but there are some ways in which it can be tightened up. There are also implications for international law. One of them is for international refugee law, which currently says that governments that sign the relevant international treaty, they're not allowed to expel refugees defined as people who legitimately fear persecution on the basis of race, religion, political opinions, and a couple of other types of characteristics. This is good insofar as it goes, but it excludes a wide range of people who are fleeing horrible oppression of other types, including people like some of the ones on the screen earlier, people fleeing communist dictatorships, people fleeing Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There are many other examples like this. Basically, where you have places where there is what I call equal opportunity oppression. People are oppressed in ways that are not directly related to their race, ethnicity, political opinions, and so forth, but just there's a government that's generally oppressive, or a war that threatens people with death but isn't specifically targeting those that fall into particular groups, then these sorts of people are excluded. And there's ways we can expand the definition of who counts as a refugee in order to deal with this. At the very least, I would advocate expanding it to include all those people who are fleeing some of the world's most oppressive governments, places like North Korea and others. There's further expansions that you can do as well. There is also the implication that we should be wary of world government, or so-called global governance, which imposes common government policies on the world as a whole. Obviously, at least until we have space colonies, which I hope we will at some point, but we don't have them yet. If you have a single policy for the entire world, you cannot vote with your feet against it. That significantly constrains people's political choice, and is particularly bad if the world government in question itself becomes tyrannical in any way. In the book, I go into the possibility that even if there's a low chance per year that a world government would become tyrannical over a period of 50 or 100 years, there's a much higher cumulative chance. So in the worst case scenario, you get what George Orwell feared: a single world government is a boot stamping on a human face forever, because there's no way out of it. And also there isn't even the example effect of other competing governments. Obviously, I don't think there's any significant chance we will get world government or anything like it in the near future, but it is something advocated by some serious thinkers, and the implication about foot voting is one that is rarely brought up other in my book. I'll end with two other points about the book. One is in terms of dealing with possible objections that I've gone through. These objections are usually lodged against international migration, but if you take them seriously, they would justify restricting internal freedom of movement as well. If you think that it's legitimate to keep people out because they might overburden the welfare state or increase crime, well, I live in Virginia, right next door to West Virginia, which is much poorer than we are, and they have a higher crime rate. So West Virginians come in, they might overburden our welfare state, they might increase our crime rate, and so on. If you think that people of particular culture should be able to keep others out, well, why not people who want to preserve the distinctive culture of Texas against Californians or Oklahomans or whoever else might want to come in? And I can make a similar point about almost every other rationale for restricting international migration. If you take it seriously, it applies to internal migration as well. Finally, I will note that 50% of all of the royalties generated by this book, they go to causes benefiting refugees. Sadly, both with the Ukraine war and other things going on in the world, that situation is more dire even than it was just a couple years ago. So thank you, and I very much look forward to your questions. Should I call in people?
Yeah.
Okay. So I know a couple of you had questions already during the presentation. If I did not answer your question during the presentation, I'm happy to take it now. I believe the gentleman in the green hair.
Green hair, okay.
It'd be green, and I don't mean that you're here, I mean that you're here and that you're wearing green, but.
Sure. I thought maybe something happened on the road.
I hope not, but please go ahead.
So you appeal a lot to the idea that, so in several cases, you give examples, like immigrants to the country are absolutely more law-abiding, immigrants to the country are more innovative, they're inventing things at a higher rate than domestic foreign citizens. That's true in a regime where it's costly to immigrate, and therefore only the people who get huge gains from immigration are willing to do it. Would that be true in a world where it was costless to immigrate?
So it's never going to be costless to immigrate, at least without radical technological changes.
Just take it to the extreme, right?
So in a world where it's truly zero cost, then maybe it would not be true, though it would still be desirable to let people move freely, because even if they still had even if they were only as productive or as innovative as natives, or even somewhat less productive and less innovative than natives, there would still be gains from migration, so long as they were more productive and more innovative in the place they moved to than in the place they left from. And I would note that the greater innovativeness and lower crime rates of immigrants existed even during those periods, and we had few or no migration restrictions in the US. And they exist currently in countries like Canada, which let in many more immigrants per capita than the US does. So it's very unlikely that these differences would go away if we had if we had no or few or no legal barriers to migration. But even if they did go away, there would still be huge aggregate gains to migration, to free migration. It's just that the gains would be smaller on a per immigrant basis, but because there would be many more immigrants, the aggregate gains would still be very large.
In a very low cost immigration regime, what could possibly explain a productivity advantage for immigrants over domestic?
So the explanation is that so long as there are differences in productivity between different parts of the world, moving to a high productivity.
That makes sense when you're comparing one person to themselves after they move,
yep.
Not comparing one person to the domestic one population there predates them.
Yeah, so my point simply is that if there was truly zero cost, not just in the sense that the physical movement was costless, but also that there was no cost to adjustment, no cost to experiencing cultural change and so forth, in a truly zero cost environment, then maybe you would no longer have an advantage, the immigrants being more productive than natives, but the immigrants would still be more productive than they themselves would be, and that would be a gain to the world as a whole, which in turn, some of that gain would inure to the natives of the destination country. So we're talking about, in this example, we're talking about something like a Star Trek world where you can just use your Star Trek transporter to materialize and dematerialize in different places and do the same thing with any physical objects that you wanted to move. And we're going even beyond Star Trek, and then we're assuming that like a Klingon moving to Earth, the cultural adjustment would be costless, and he or she would immediately be able to function in Earth culture or Vulcan culture without having to engage in any costly adjustments of any kind. In that world, we indeed perhaps would not see immigrants being more productive than otherwise similar natives, but we would still, but if we posit that, and I think this is probably true in the Star Trek universe, if you posit that the institutions of Earth tend toward greater productivity than those of the Klingon homeworld, I think it's called Romulus. No, it's not Romulus, it's called Romulus. It's no, not beautiful, the Romulan homeworld, but whatever the Klingon homeworld is, it maybe the Klingons are less productive. Maybe people there are less productive than those on Earth. Then if the Klingons could move to Earth at zero cost, and zero difficulties of adjustment, then that would imply the effects that I just mentioned.
Last follow-up question.
Sure.
Somebody else changes.
Sure.
How much of the GDP estimate is based on comparing immigrants to the pre-existing population, and how much is driven by comparing immigrants to themselves in their adopted country versus their home country?
So there are several different ways of calculating this. If you're interested in this, Michael Clemens in his classic article on this called $1 Trillion Bills on the Sidewalk, he goes through a bunch of different ways. The bottom line is that all the different ways lead to huge results. The doubling is really sort of the midpoint of the possible estimates. But if you say, like, I believe one of the more conservative estimates, which said instead of doubling, it'll only be 50% greater, that's still enormous, right? It's a good question. There are different ways of calculating it. If you want to know the different ways, read his article and some of the surrounding literature. But because the differences in institutional quality between countries are so large, it's going to be a big difference no matter how you look at it, or at least under any plausible economic theory. I'd like to talk more about the Klingons, but instead I will go to the next question.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
I have like 7 questions.
Okay, so I'll go to what perhaps hopefully will be your less than 7 questions, then I'll go to his 7.
Great. Let's see. So the question I have is, I'll be a little sarcastic in this and say, where do I move to avoid inflation?
Sure.
So within the United States, of course, you have federalism and the idea that at the top there, I agree 100% that voting is ineffectual. You can't vote these things out. If there's poor policy, but it's not that I can really move to avoid that. And then let me add to this that my grandparents came here from Portugal, and I think that it's not culture so much to me as it is the question of freedom. So I think it's a definition type of thing. So they moved here with their culture, which they felt very strong and strongly attached to, but believed in the idea of freedom and the American dream. And that was very unique because it didn't involve all of these sort of attributes and identifying people by this group or that group or this country or that country or whatever, that everybody was a big melting pot. And that's kind of what made things unique. And to me, is what attracted everybody that's here. So I think there are some issues to me with the definition part of this. So, to me, it's currently on the wrong path, and we're moving more towards measuring the attributes and getting into actually some of the problems that you're talking about. I think that in the United States, of course, there's times in history when we can point to discrimination and all of these problems, but maybe if we actually moved more towards the principles of freedom, then these desires can be fulfilled and accepting the people that want to have freedom, not necessarily the culture, but freedom that allows you to change and grow.
So I think there's at least 3 different issues that raises, maybe more. If I'm missing something, you can follow up in a moment. One is there may be some things you can't move to avoid, like if we have a single currency for the entire US and it's being inflated, moving from one state to another won't get you anywhere. That's true. There's not a perfect remedy for that, but obviously international migration can help with that. And there is a history of people moving out of countries with chronic high inflation. Argentina suffered more out migration when they had chronic high inflation, and under policies I favor would be more opportunity to escape these things. A second possibility, and I'm not a monetary economist, I don't know whether this is truly desirable or not, but you could potentially have subnational currencies. For instance, many people argue that the European Union made a mistake in creating the euro they should have maintained their previous regime of having freedom of movement throughout the European Union, but different national currencies. There are actually still some countries that are members of the European Union that don't have the euro. So I'm not saying necessarily this is the best policy for the US, but if each state had its own currency, potentially you'd have lower inflation states versus higher inflation states. I'm not fully advocating this, but again, monetary economics actually respect the limits of my expertise. So it would be so terrible if we had 50 different currencies that the benefit, the cost would outweigh this benefit. But decentralization is another way of dealing with that. A second issue that your question raises is that sort of maybe the concern that we have is not that immigrants may have a bad culture, but that they might have bad attitudes towards freedom. So they vote in socialist policies or fascist policies or whatnot. And this is one of these questions towards which my three-part framework can address. One is, it turns out that at least for the US and Canada and Western Europe, this isn't that big a problem, in that if you measure the political views of immigrants compared to those of natives, on most issues, there's not that big a difference. There is a big difference in immigration itself. Immigrants are more, on average, more pro-immigration than natives, but on most other issues, first and second generation immigrants, it's not a big difference. A modest difference, sometimes in what I would think is a good direction, sometimes what I think is a bad direction, but it's not that big a difference. And on top of that, recent immigrants on a per capita basis have less political influence than natives, because they vote at lower rates and they participate in politics at lower rates by a much greater margin. They don't contribute much in the way of financial contribution to campaigns and the like. If you think that immigrant political participation is a good thing, you may view that negatively. But if you worry that immigrants will vote for wrong people, then you should be reassured by these kinds of numbers. But if you worry that actually it is a problem, again, as I said before, you can extend the period before which they're allowed to be citizens. You could make the test harder or change the composition of the test and so forth. So there are keyholes for that. Finally, in terms of the goal is to promote a general society of freedom, immigration restrictions obviously themselves severely restrict people's freedom. Certainly that's true for the immigrants, but it's even true for the natives, right? Because the natives are restricted from hiring immigrants for jobs, they're restricted from working at businesses those immigrants might found, they're restricted from marrying the immigrants and socializing with them. And it's even the case that with our immigration enforcement regime, we view things like every year there are hundreds or even thousands of current US citizens that end up in immigration detention, and in some cases even get deported because the due process protections are so bad that sometimes before ICE and other government agencies figure out that this person is actually a US citizen, weeks or months might pass. So, and there are other ways in which the liberty of natives are also restricted by immigration restrictions as well. You can in theory imagine a scenario where the impact of immigration on liberty is so bad that it outweighs all of that, and none of the keyholes that I mentioned would be effective, but such cases are extreme and rare. There's not even actually one historical example you can point to of a liberal democratic government being significantly degraded by immigration, whereas on the other hand, there are many examples where they're significantly degraded by native-born nationalists, including people who advocate the kinds of ideologies, immigration restrictions, like obviously Nazi Germany is the most extreme example, but there are many other ones. I'm not saying all of these cases are like Nazi Germany, but even less extreme sort of native-born nationalists who are not as bad as Nazis, they still have undermined quite a lot of liberal democratic regimes. Vladimir Putin is the product of this sort of movement. What's happening in Turkey is the result of this kind of ideology. Orban in Hungary, and I can go on with many, many other examples like that. So if we're going to restrict freedom for the purpose of preventing bad governments from coming into power, native nationalists are probably a better target for your efforts. I'm not saying that's what you want to do, but for those who do want to do that, that's probably a better target for their efforts than immigration is. In the book, in the new edition, I also talked about the argument that the problem with immigration is not that the immigrants themselves have bad political views, but that they will stimulate negative reactions by natives. So the natives might be, the problem is not that the immigrants are fascist or communists or whatever, but that the natives might become fascist in response to immigrants. And in the book, I give various answers to that concern. I won't go through them all because I want to take more time, so I probably have already spent more time on that question I did before. I know I promised you would get to go next, but I have not forgotten about your question.
All right, so let me tackle to the beginning of the talk when we're talking about food voting within the U.S.
Yes.
In particular. Do we have enough evidence on people actually moving because they're moving
for policy
policies versus just like, you know, I have got a job in Texas, there are more jobs in Texas, you don't really care if you're going to have abortion or either.
Yeah. So
No. The economics is a result of policy to some extent, but there's like all sorts of other policies, a bundle of policies, right?
Yeah.
And do we have a way?
Yes. So to some extent, he partially provided the answer that I was going to give.
It's lack of policy.
Yeah. So to some extent, lack of policy is also a policy when the state or local government had the option of implementing a policy. So I agree, certainly there are things that determine where you migrate that are unrelated to policy. Like, even though I don't have this preference myself, lots of data shows people prefer warmer weather, right? So one of the reasons why Florida is a big gainer from interstate migration, people like weather. I don't. I hate hot, humid weather, but most people don't feel that way. And there's other factors like that. Like, if you fall in love and the person, your true love says, like, I only want to live in Nome, Alaska, that's the only place I want to be. That could be an example of you move there because, you know, for her, because to be with her, even otherwise, like, I hate Nome, I don't like the cold or whatever. Nonetheless, there is a lot of evidence that the things that drive most interstate migration in the US are at least related to policy. Jobs are a big factor. Housing costs are a big factor. Taxation rates matter as well. There's also some evidence that more diverse jurisdictions and more tolerant jurisdictions attract more people also. So if you look at sort of the places in the US that attract the most people, they tend to be actually places like Austin, which are sort of blue, relatively tolerant jurisdictions within red states, where the red state government constrains to some degree the local jurisdictions more sort of what would otherwise be their more interventionist economic policy. So I completely agree that policy is not the only thing that drives migration, either interstate or even internationally, but it's a big factor, especially when you include these indirect effects on jobs, housing, crime, and, you know, other things of that sort.
So here's my follow-up.
Sure.
The reason I'm glad you got to the Austin part. It's sort of like, seems that there's a dynamic where, and this applies to California, where yes, the red state is very attracted by its economic policies, lots of good things, and then a lot more quote cosmopolitan, tolerant place like Austin might be very attracted to a certain kind of people, and that becomes this sort of sweet spot, right? But then there's a tendency, and it's not very exacerbated of late, but it did happen in California, that the whole state of California then turns into a giant group thing that then undermines all the policies that the red state was keeping in charge, control, and then all this migration ended up leading to a problem in California, and now people are moving out, right? So with freedom of movement in different directions, it's great at different opportunities places. And I think you see within the US this notion that, yeah, you went to California for a while, now people moving out of California, maybe now Texas, you see people maybe sometimes now people move out of Texas. And that's sort of like, if I can think about that model called a role model, it seems that okay, people had open borders that would flow just like here, and it would be totally fine. But here's my concern. If we have some competitive units in the West, they're all sort of okay, and the differences locally, and then you can see these movement going back and forth. But in the world, do you foresee a situation where, I don't know what the estimate is, that 1 billion people come to the West if you were to open there, right? So this would be, the US would be such an attractive beacon for people. And yeah, that would be dynamic and great for a while, but that could turn into something that will be very.
Yeah, so I think there's several different questions that are contained in that. Let me try to break them down. So I'll take it from the end. First, like, isn't there a risk of swamping, right? That so many people might come in that like they would swamp the local culture or local political system, and if that system is good, at least in some important ways, they could get swamped. I have a couple kinds of response to that argument. Like, I have a whole section devoted to swamping in chapter 6 of the book. One is that it's unlikely to happen that fast because job markets, real estate markets, and moving costs constrain people from moving that quickly. And therefore, well, eventually we might have a doubling of the US population or something like that. It would not happen. It would happen over a period of 20 or 30 years rather than over a period of 1 or 2 years. There's a downside to that, and that is that the big economic gains, some of them would take a while to happen as well, but sort of immediate swamping is unlikely. Secondly, there are studies done, many of them by Alex Nevrastek, my colleague at the Cato Institute. I have a second job at the Cato Institute in addition to my job at George Mason. Alex has done some good research on places like Jordan and Israel, which have in fact recently had big sudden influxes of people. And not only that, those big sudden influxes were people moving from places which were illiberal and had bad political cultures. In Israel's case, Russian Jews, people like me, who rapidly rose from being maybe a small percentage of Israel's population, being like 25% of the total. In Jordan's case, Palestinians fleeing from Kuwait and the Gulf countries and the like. And in each case, there was no evidence of degradation of institutional culture and the like. Now that doesn't, so the combination of the fact of how fast it really would be and also these empirical cases, this doesn't categorically rule out the possibility that in some conceivable situation you get a swamping effect, but it makes it much less likely, particularly for a big country with well-established institutions like the US. In the book, I give the example of Estonia faced by Russia. They have only 1 million people in Estonia. Russia has 100 million right next door, and it's much more illiberal than Estonia. So a swamping scenario there is at least somewhat plausible. In the case of the US and most other more sizable first world nations, that swamping scenario is extremely unlikely. You could say, well, even a small chance of this is not worth it, but you can also posit that not letting in more people, there's a small chance of catastrophe as well. For instance, you might keep out the person who would otherwise have created the cure for the next pandemic that kills millions of people. There is a real chance that migration restrictions would prevent that. So if you're gonna weigh low probability catastrophic scenarios, they're gonna be weighed on both sides. The other question that I think that raises, and I'm not sure if this entirely had in mind, is the fear of a kind of big sort that all the conservatives or most of them would move to one set of place, all the liberals would another set of place. It'd be more polarized. These areas would be more homogenous, and that is a concern raised by some people. And I address that in the book as well. My answer to it is that when you look at actual migration patterns, they don't actually break down along left-right ideological lines that much. For instance, Texas is one of the biggest gainers of interstate migrants over the last couple of decades. But if you look at surveys of are they Democrats or Republicans, they're actually divided almost 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, because when people vote with their feet, they make their decisions in a more sophisticated way that include left-right ideological lines. I'm not that worried about a big sort happening. If there are some places which are overwhelmingly left or overwhelmingly right, that's not a terrible thing, because Heather Gerken, the dean of Yale Law School, who's becoming dean, she wrote an important article on what she calls second-order diversity, where she points out that you wouldn't want all of the institutions in a system to be internally diverse in the same way. Like if they all had 50% Democrats and 50% Republicans, the same percentages of whites, blacks, Hispanics, and other groups, the same percentage of different religions, that even though there would be internal diversity in each place, every place would actually be exactly the same as every place else. So you might want some places whose internal diversity is skewed so as to create more of what she calls second order diversity. So we wouldn't want every place to be homogenous, but we also wouldn't want every place to be diverse in exactly the same way. And fortunately, foot voting usually gets us somewhere in a happy middle between those two extremes. I don't know, yes, you were waiting patiently, please go ahead.
Sure, you finished your speech off with the perils of world government.
Yeah.
But earlier in the speech, you referred to certain issues which could only be handled worldwide.
Yeah.
You mentioned global warming, which I thought is now called climate change.
Yeah.
I mean,
So I'm old-fashioned, I'm using the old-fashioned term.
I'm curious what other issues you see out there that can only be handled by the world government.
So I don't believe
vaccinations to save everyone from those diseases.
Yeah. So I would say one is only handled on a worldwide level doesn't necessarily mean that a world government is necessary to do it. It could be dealt with through cooperation between a few of the most powerful nations or blocs. Secondly, I think that there are very few, if any, other such issues. Climate change is almost the only one, because the characteristic that you would want to have in an issue like that is that it's a global public good in an economic sense. and also that individual nations have little or relatively little incentive to try to address it, at least address on the scale that would be necessary. Therefore, with vaccination, there are advantages to individual nations getting their populations vaccinated, even if the rest of the world doesn't. And therefore, I'm not so worried in that kind of case. And in fact, we did just see individual nations vaccinate their population, not always really as quickly as would be desirable, but we certainly, very few people in the US said we shouldn't vaccinate the US until Canada gets vaccinated, until Europe, like hardly, whereas it's common for people to say, well, maybe we should restrict our emissions, but only if China restricts theirs, because if we restrict ours, but they don't restrict theirs, the scale, they may even increase theirs, wherever, and the scale of the problem would just be the same. So I think there's very few issues which have this characteristic of being a global public good, and also there's relatively little incentive for individual nations to address them. Now, maybe returning to Star Trek, if the Klingons were going to invade the Earth or whatever, there's a threat of extraterrestrial invasion, maybe that would be a global public good of a similar kind, and you can posit other scenarios. But in general, I think such cases are rare, which is why I think the vast majority of functions of government can be at the very least done by individual nations, and in many cases decentralized to lower levels of that.
And as a follow-up question,
Sure.
Let's say we signed a treaty, whatever you want to call it, with the Chinese to reduce emissions, and they didn't follow the treaty, or
So if I had a simple, easy solution to that problem, I would have written a book about that. But obviously there's an entire literature on international agreements and when people have incentives to follow them. And sometimes they do, and then once you commit to an agreement, if you violate it, that damages your reputation and makes it and it makes it harder for you to get other agreements that you want in the future. There might be, sanctions that can be imposed or the like. But yes, it is difficult, particularly with something like climate change, where if we want to, where like a significant reduction in emissions means that it's it's a costly thing to do. And it's you guys perhaps should host a whole other event on that kind of issue.
We have.
Oh yeah, you probably, so I'm not going to all the events that you've done. But the last thing I would mention about it is I do have a section on environmental harms in my book, where I point out that in general, wealthier societies deal better with environmental problems than poorer ones. Free migration can make the world vastly wealthier, which means more technological innovation. And it also means that if we do have to restrict emissions, it will be less painful for a much wealthier society to do it than for a relatively poor one. Doesn't mean that we would definitively succeed in addressing that problem, but the wealthier we are, I think the more likely it is that we could do it, and also the more likely that we can come up with clean energy innovations. Though, as Brian Kaplan, who's sitting here, has pointed out, in some ways we already have a valuable form of clean energy that we're underutilizing in the form of nuclear power. But I imagine also a wealthier society could do more in the way of utilizing nuclear power as well. Since I mentioned you, Brian, I will call on you next. And I know you want to speak again, but you did ask the previous questions. So I'm trying to get in people who have not spoken yet. Brian, go ahead.
I've got a story about why so many people do not like the idea of foot voting. Sure. And it's this. The idea of foot voting shows a great hypocrisy such that people complain about things, but they would never actually take it seriously after going to avoid. And on the other hand, there are many things that people barely talk about and actually are highly motivating. And it really just holds up a mirror to humanity and it upsets people.
Yeah, so I know you've written blog posts about this. I know exactly what we're talking about, but I want to expand a little bit for those who do not religiously read every one of your posts as I do. So I think what Brian is talking about, you can correct me if I have you wrong, but is that if you ask people sort of what is the most important thing in the world, or what are some that they might think, religion, high moral principles, serving the interest of the nation and so forth. But then if you see what is it that motivates people to vote with their feet, for most people, it's things like, in this place, I didn't get I'll get a better job, lower taxes. For some people, it is also that they don't get to practice their religion and the like. So that is actually a not uncommon situation. So the argument, I guess, there is that people's real priorities are less noble than what they say they are. And I think that's true to some extent. I'm not convinced that this is what motivates opposition to foot voting. I think a much more common source of opposition to foot voting is an implicit assumption that the world is sort of zero sum. So more gains for migrants means less for us. And also, when it comes to international migration, the biggest single predictor of being opposed to it is your general level of xenophobia and suspicion of foreigners, which is partially related to this zero-sum mentality, but partially also related to a sort of natural human sense of in-group, out-group kind of dynamics. It is not my argument, by the way, that means there are no serious objections to migration rights that can be raised. There are intellectually serious objections. My point is simply that the intellectually serious objections are not usually the main reasons why public opinion doesn't like footloading, or a lot of it doesn't like it. I'm also not convinced that this sort of fear of recognizing hypocrisy of the kind that Brian points to is a major motivator, though if you have survey data which suggests that it is, I'm happy to consider it. Yes?
So the optimal world is a world that it's very hard for us to get to.
Sure.
In the sense that, every single, almost the vast majority of countries in the world have Arab English. Yeah. Very, very difficult to change all over, right? But if you were to now, start by saying the 2025 new administration, you're in charge of drafting a plan, get us to more immigration. What are the sort of priorities?
So I'll make a general point about that and more specific points. The general point is this, there might be some issues where you can achieve a big improvement, but you can only achieve it if you go all the way. There are some forms of deregulation where that might be true. I've heard it said in sort of electricity deregulation is like this. You can have huge gains, but only if you go all the way and do it just right. And if you go halfway, you're going to sink like a still, and it's going to be terrible. With lowering immigration restrictions and also lowering domestic barriers to freedom of movement, it's not like this. If the US takes 10% more migrants per year, that's another 100,000 people that live a freer and happier life every year. And it's a big gain for the natives as well. If we reduce zoning restrictions in places which have severe ones by 10 or 20%, that's thousands of new houses that can be built, also thousands of people that can move to opportunity. And I could go on with examples like this. So this is an area where even if you're not as radical as I am, and most people admittedly are not, there's huge amounts of room for incremental improvement and relatively little likelihood that making an incremental improvement will lead you to some sort of trap, like with the super complex electricity deregulation, or with certain kinds of monetary policy reforms I mentioned earlier, where I wasn't sure whether those reforms are justifiable or not. So there's lots and lots of opportunities. I'm not a great short-term political strategist. If I were, I'd make a more lucrative income doing something else than what I'm actually doing. But I do have some thoughts on things that can be done. Some are actually being done right now. The Biden administration has massively expanded private refugee sponsorship with the Uniting for Ukraine program, where I actually have participated as a sponsor. You can now, by filling out a pretty simple form, you can sponsor not just one, but an entire family of Ukrainians to come into the US in a very simple process. And he had just now expanded that to include people from 4 other countries, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and Haiti. The Uniting for Ukraine parties have proven to be pretty popular and a durable reform. And already over something like over 150,000 people have been authorized to come into the US in less than a year. And Canada has done private refugee sponsorship of this kind for many years, enabling thousands of people to move that way. So it seems like what makes these programs relatively popular is the sense of well, if anything goes wrong, the sponsor will be responsible, which is a legal matter, by the way, is not true. But people but public opinion seems to be reassured by that. And also, obviously, in some cases, it makes a difference that there's great sympathy for some of the particular groups, like with the Ukrainians who really are fleeing wars. That's true, although it's also the case that many migrants from other places are also fleeing comparable wars. There's other kinds of low-hanging fruit that can potentially be picked off in certain places as well. But I'm not a great short-term strategist. I will merely mention this one more thing, which is that I think advocates of lowering immigration restrictions have not sufficiently learned the lessons of previous successful struggles for greater freedom and equality, like the abolition movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement. Those movements were successful in large part by showing that the groups for whom they wanted to increase freedom were not fundamentally different from the rest of us. So, and therefore that the barriers against them were arbitrary. So the most famous symbol of the anti-slavery movement was this picture of a black man in chains, and underneath is a sign saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Right? So the idea is ultimately a black man is a man in much the same way as a white man is. So it's arbitrary to say because he's black he should be a slave. Gay rights advocates, women's rights advocates, and so on made similar points. To my mind, advocates of lowering immigration restrictions have not sufficiently emphasized this point of what we have is an arbitrary restriction based on who your parents are, where you were born, that's similar to racial and ethnic discrimination. I'm not saying this argument will persuade everybody, but it has been very successful in past movements. And Martin Luther King, similar message. Martin Luther King in his speeches, he would say things like that the color, we should judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. That was more persuasive than the report of the President's Council of Economic Advisors issued the same year, which pointed out correctly that if you eliminate segregation and various forms of discrimination, blacks would be more productive and therefore the overall economy would be better. Absolutely correct, Econ 101. I would bet, Brian, you would agree with that, but hardly anybody was persuaded by the report of the Council of Economic Advisors, whereas millions of people over time were persuaded by arguments like the kind that King made. And the same thing with anti-slavery. There was a man named Hidden Helper who wrote a couple of lengthy books arguing that poor whites would be better off in an economic sense from the abolition of slavery because then slave labor wouldn't compete with poor white labor or the other beneficial economic effects. Hidden Helper was much less successful than Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote with her book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which all of you probably have heard of. Uncle Tom's Cabin does not talk about, if Uncle Tom were free, whites would be better off economically. They actually would be if he was free. What the book is on is how Uncle Tom is the person not fundamentally different from white people. And hundreds of thousands of people bought her book, read it, and said, wow, this seems true. Whereas Hidden Helper's book sales were much lower than hers, and he was much less successful.
I see what you're planning, Bryce planning.
Sorry?
I see what your books are, aiming at.
So don't get me wrong, in my book, I do in fact have lots of policy wonkery type things too, like about peoples and the rest. But I do that not because I think it will persuade public opinion, but because I think an intellectually serious defense of a position has to address serious arguments on the other side. But I do not believe that either I or anybody can achieve big changes in public opinion with arguments about keyholes and the like. I just think that to advance the state of our knowledge on this issue, we have to address serious arguments, or some of us have to. If I were a politician or an activist, I might do things differently, but I think that's not where my comparative advantage lies. But to those who are activists, I would urge them to talk about, we are restricting people based on who their parents are, where they were born. It's just as arbitrary as racial segregation was, or as discrimination against women was. And similarly, I've written a bit. About this. There's some great work in how same-sex marriage succeeded as quickly as it did. What the big successful argument that advocates made was that same-sex relations are fundamentally similar to opposite-sex ones. They love each other, they can raise children, they get all the same. And so why should we arbitrarily limit their ability to do that on that basis when we allow heterosexuals to do it? And they did not prevail by arguing, gays will be more productive if they can get married, and that in turn will improve society as a whole. And that's true, by the way. They can be and are, but it's not the kind of argument that persuaded many people. Yes.
So you mentioned decentralizing government and federalism on the smaller scale, but does that need to go hand in hand with open migration?
So not necessarily. If we expand foot voting within countries, then that's a good thing, even if we don't simultaneously expand international migration. But it's even better if we do both simultaneously. Indeed, there are synergies. because when a person moves to the US, let's say, they can also choose between 50 different states. In fact, when I was working with our sponsor family, the Identity for Ukraine program, this is actually something we talked about with them, like which state they should go to. They eventually picked a state in part because they already had friends who were living there, which for immigrant adjustment is important. But if you have decentralization within countries, that suddenly moving to the United States is not even just the US versus your previous country, it's potentially 50 different options, and or even maybe thousands of different options, thinking about local governments as well as state governments as possibilities. So there are these synergies. But even if we have exactly the same immigration policies we do now and we don't change them in any way, it would still be advantageous to expand foot voting opportunities within the United States and also within other countries as well. Other questions? I know we've been going for a while, and I don't want to keep people from their exciting Friday.
Yeah, I don't want to keep you, and you must be tired. So,
no, I could go all night and all day talking about this stuff. You might be Brian knows, but I
have some questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Related to this point of foot voting, certainly you mentioned that the major barriers to voting are things like housing restrictions.
In the U.S.
In the U.S., yeah, exactly. In the U.S. Isn't that a lot of evidence also of one of the major problems these days is that a lot of federal government benefits are attached to things that your state level sort of like administrator of that plan. So a poor person in West Virginia that's on some sort of welfare right now, if that person has an opportunity in Texas, it's actually more complicated for them to be able to and not lose their benefits.
So there are some federal benefits which work like that. Then the aggregate effect is much less than that of housing restrictions. But there are some effects like that where in particular you might get, or what's really at stake often is that state benefits vary somewhat in that respect, though actually the Supreme Court has ruled that that a new arrival has to get the same benefits as existing residents of the state. So that to some extent eliminates that, but not totally. There is also the issue of in the tax code, in the way the U.S. healthcare policy works is that there is a strong incentive for health insurance to be attached to your employer, and that limits mobility somewhat in that you can't keep the same health insurance. And this is the point that I should have included in the book, but maybe if there's ever a third edition, I will, that it would be desirable to make the tax treatment of health insurance that you buy independently of your employer be equal to that which you get from your employer, because if you get it through your employer, then it's tax-free. And it would also be desirable to allow people more opportunity to buy health insurance across state lines. But those barriers are not as significant in terms of their effects as exclusionary zoning, which is by far the biggest domestic American constraint. The second biggest one may be occupational licensing, in that some 30% of American workers have to have licenses to their jobs. And it's not just the doctors or lawyers like me, it's people like hairdressers and so forth. With our Ukrainian family, ironically, the single biggest bureaucratic problem we run into so far is that one of them, she's a professional hairdresser. She's worked on that for several years in Ukraine and now later briefly in Spain. But it turns out that to become licensed as a hairdresser in Florida, it is possible that she will have to take 1,200 hours of classes. It costs thousands of dollars and takes 9 months. It all depends, whether she has to or not, depends on a technical point of Florida law that I and some other experts are helping her to try to deal with. But even if she doesn't have to take the class, she will still have to take a complicated exam in English, which obviously is difficult for a just arrived immigrant. And all of this for a person who's very obvious that she is a hairdresser. She's been doing it for several years. And if it turns out, God forbid, that she's a bad hairdresser, consumers can figure that out. They're like, after you get one bad haircut. This is not like she's doing brain surgery or whatever, but yet this has turned out to be actually harder to deal with than the process of entering the U.S., which in the case of Uniting for Ukraine beneficiaries is remarkably fast. For those who are interested in this, I have an article that I wrote about this in the Washington Post, which is based not just on my experience, but the general structure of the program. And if you don't want to get through the Washington Post paywall, the Cato Institute has reprinted it on their website where it's available for free. If you Google my name and United for Ukraine, you can find this.
All right.